Guys, just to recap, because I know we have, we're still getting our rosters together here, so anybody who is new here today, give me a minute after the end of class and we'll get you all caught up. For some reminders, guys, we actually talked on Wednesday about revised work rules for the class. And guys, I just want to cover this for purposes of discussion. Unions have work rules with employers so they can come to agreements on how actual work gets done. It can be everything from the hours of employment, the pay structures, to safety regulations. So this is a good simulation of how a real-world working environment works. So to recap, guys, I probably cannot do the online Fridays as was suggested. The main reason being, I kind of joked about it in the last class, it would look really bad if the administration showed up when I was scheduled to be teaching you and discovered nobody was here. That would look bad for you. It looked really bad for me. I like being employed. So that part I probably cannot do, but we are going to do some occasional online days. That means occasionally, if there's material that we can cover better online, we'll do it that way, especially when we start getting closer to some of our class exercises. Guys, in terms of the online tests, I'm going to reiterate, as we go through chapters 1 through 3, as long as we have active discussion in this class, and I believe that people are assimilating the material on their own, I have no reason to doubt that you're internalizing it. Meaning, we could certainly do online tests, but the conversations have to happen. And my internal figure for this is we need about an 85% rate in terms of people participating in class. To me, if we can get up to a high B or a solid B in participation, that means we can get rid of the in-class tests. There is not going to be weekend homework in this class, with the exception of extended due dates. So, for example, my general practice was going to be Monday due dates. It's now going to be Wednesday due dates, meaning that you're never going to have to worry about this being due on Monday. That being said, if we extend an assignment, we may venture into Monday territory there. And the question had been, finally, what about papers? Do we have alternative ideas? I'm actually going to reduce the papers that we're doing in this class, I think, in favor of more in-person and alternative activities such as discussion boards. We may even experiment with some other things like podcasts or something too. I'm still working my mind out on that one. Guys, in terms of other things that are happening, today we're most likely going to be finishing up Chapter 1, and I finally think I got the recording issue figured out in these rooms, so I will be posting a new link for our YouTube channel. Honestly, what was happening, the account I was using was cutting off time and wasn't allowing me to upload full videos, so I think I've got that figured out. In addition, guys, coming up not next Friday, but a week after that, on, I believe the date on that is the 19th or something, I'll post it for you. We have a representative for the United Mine Workers Association of America, former international rep, who's coming to speak to you to talk about what it was like to organize a union in this region and what some of the challenges were working with management, working with companies. Now, we're also going to represent the other side of the opinion. As I've said to you guys from the get-go, the intent and purpose of this class is not to tell you what you should think of organized labor or management. It's to give you the tools to make up your own mind and see that there are oftentimes balancing acts required. Before we dive into material for today, are there any questions about how I'm setting this up? You guys remember, you do have an assignment that is due to tell me your immediate opinion of unions, 2 sources of material. I don't care about overly formal writing. You guys, has everybody started on that? If you haven't, please do so. Any questions before we get in, guys? Okay, we're going to start off with a little bit of current events. When I say current, something that has been ongoing for about the last year or so. Johns Hopkins, one of the most noteworthy hospital systems in the United States, nurses are attempting to organize there. I'm going to show you a brief video about why they're attempting to organize. We're going to talk about some of the changing faces of unions in the 21st century and actually some of the changing motivations. So sit back and listen to that. Not been resolved. Any observations in terms of why the nurses themselves are talking about organizing? Go ahead.
Well, the guy was mentioning about how they're getting they're understaffed in a sense. They're working a lot of hours and getting a lot of patients per nurse. And I guess they're all getting stressed, and I imagine they probably want better pay and maybe some better benefits. And then it seemed like some of them even were kind of upset that they weren't promoted up to a management spot, being they put a lot of time into the hospital.
So we're here a lot about working conditions, yes.
And like I just want to say, like they said about like understaffing, that's a nationwide thing too, though.
certainly is.
Because that's where I did an internship over the summer at mgmt2038302019, and that's the biggest issue that we talk about almost every time. Every department we went to, they said, we need more nurses, we need more nurses. You just can't.
Yes.
My mom's a nurse, and when she is completely understaffed, and it ruins like the quality of the time you give the patient because then you just rushing and stuff.
For sure, for sure. Other observations. You guys are hitting on some key points. And for full disclosure, because I always believe that I need to be honest with you guys, my wife is a union nurse at UPMC Altoona, so when I make these statements, I'm making them independent of her views. What did you not hear the representative of the unions talking about? What did they not talk about? Nobody mentioned pay. What they were talking about here was working conditions, patient care standards, the idea, can we better do our jobs? Are we being represented within the organization? One of the popular views of unions, in fact, one of the stereotypes often, is that people who are in unions are only after money and job stability. In this case, it's a different kind of mindset. The other thing, too, guys, when we think of the stereotypes of unions, because we're only in the first week of this class, when we think of the stereotype in the United States of unions, what kind of industries do we typically think about?
Trade work.
Exactly. And it's one of these things, and this is no disrespect to people who work in the trades, but we're seeing a resurgence now of professional unions. For example, when we talked on Wednesday, we saw the communication workers union. Here we're seeing the nurses union. There are pushes within white-collar trades, even journalists, an example. Actually, some other folks who have unions who may not realize the Screen Actors Guild of America, all the actors who make the TV shows we all like to watch, most of them are members of unions. So are directors, the Directors Guild, and so are people who play professional sports. The NFL is one of the most powerful unions in sports in America. So this is the changing face of organized labor. Any questions or observations about this particular industry before we move in? Yes, sir.
At the end, they mentioned that some nurses were not in favor of nurses unionizing and their nurses themselves. Do unions, when you're implementing it, do it like utilitarianism approach for like the majority, or how does that work for the people who don't want to unionize, like during discussions?
Well, you're asking an excellent question. And the way it works, for example, and we'll get more into the specifics of how unions get organized in later chapters, but here's your general rules of thumb. In the United States, we have two basic designations. We have what's generically referred to as union states or right-to-work states. There's two different designations. In a right-to-work state, you cannot be forced to be a member of a union under certain circumstances. And there are nuances we're going to get into. But basically speaking, there are states, most of them south of the Mason-Dixon. The southern U.S. tends to be very anti-union. The Northeast and the northern parts of the country tend to be more amenable to unions. So, for example, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you can work for a shop. If you work at UPMC Altoona, you cannot pay union dues and choose not to be a member of the union, but you're still represented by the collective bargaining agreement, if that makes sense. I know that's very complicated. There's a lot of details to this. So when we get to the following chapters, we're going to be talking about the real bottom line is it depends where you're at, but generally speaking, there's a push by corporate America to allow people to not pay union dues and to choose not to be represented by unions too. So there's opposing forces here. Any other questions or observations? What I gave you was a very vast oversimplification because we're going to get into those details in the next couple of chapters. Ma'am. I agree, and it's one of these things that if you're looking at the labor perspective or the management perspective, the labor perspective, these are people who are willing to show their face on camera and speak about their viewpoints. And the fact that Johns Hopkins would not make a statement, I don't think that was a good move for them in terms of establishing where they're coming from and addressing some of these concerns. I think it would have been a much easier response for Johns Hopkins if they had been talking about financial issues and Hopkins would have come out and said something to the effect of, we're a competitive pay employer, we pay standards for our region. Saying nothing sometimes says a lot. So, great points, guys. Any other points before we move on? Guys, the kind of observations that you have, by the way, are things that I really want you to feel comfortable bringing into the conversation here. Guys, in terms of what affects our work rules, how the economy is doing for example, is a really good indicator how your day at work is going to go. We talk about, for example, the recession in 2008, and I promise this ties in, guys. What caused the recession of 2008 in the United States? What caused it? Yes.
The housing market.
Yeah, the housing market tanked. And so when the housing market tanked, all of a sudden nobody's buying homes because people are upside down in their mortgages. What other industries did the housing market affect when they went on? Yes.
Auto industry.
Auto industry. What else?
The banking.
Banking. What else?
Any retail, because no one had a lot of money to spend.
Exactly right. Pretty much everything. It went downhill. All of a sudden people are losing their jobs because they had industries that were associated with this financial crash, and all of a sudden people are getting laid off. The unemployment rate hit around 12% at the worst part of the recession. And so when it comes down to it, economic conditions affect a lot of things. We're going to try to get rid of excess people in our company because we're not making the same money, so we're going to try to keep from paying as many people. That's one way we do it. This crosses over into HR territory. Has anybody ever worked for a company where they tried like hell to avoid you getting overtime? Raise your hand if you've been in that movie. And the recession, it got worse too. All of a sudden, we don't have excess funds, so we're going to try to make you work harder during the hours you're working, so I don't have to pay you overtime. Overtime over 40 hours a week in the United States is, you got it, and it can be wage or compensable time. So your conditions of employment for the people who kept their jobs in 2008 actually got worse for a lot of people. You had fewer people who were doing more work and being asked to do it in less time. If you go back to a 12% unemployment rate versus where we're at with right now, around 3%, which one of those bodes better for employees? Yeah, 3 or 4%. You can name your price because companies need to hire people to expand. Back in 2008, people were just happy to have jobs. I remember this, guys. I was working for a technology part of St. Francis at that time, back when I was in the administration. I had an entry-level technology job open, and I was getting PhD candidates applying for entry-level wages because they couldn't get a job and they'd been downsized. That's how bad it can get. We also, if you look at the work rules of the labor market, for example, if we have skilled labor around, we can demand more of our employees. If we don't, the work rules may have to include training. And by the way, guys, this is something I say to you guys all generally. By show of hands, how many of you are juniors or seniors? Okay. When you apply for your first job in the open market, and you don't think your resume is perfect, I'm telling you not to worry. Almost every employer realizes to some extent they're going to have to train you. To get a resume when all the things that an employer is asking for, that's kind of like somebody's dating profile. Like they're looking for the perfect mate, and the perfect mate does not exist. Really, you start off saying, I want this person to look this way, I want them to behave like this, and by the end of it, you're settling for the fact that they don't pick their teeth and they don't defecate in public. So it comes down to lowering your standards. And I'm not saying that you guys are low standards. I'm saying that we sometimes settle and we turn people into who we want them to be. I can't believe I record this stuff sometimes. When will I learn? It comes down to the idea, though, too, in a given labor market, there may also be shifts in what's required. Here's a great example, and this crosses over with human resource management for anybody in that class as well. Ford Motor Company, how has their demands for labor changed in the last 25 years? What's different about working for Ford Manufacturing now? Totally. More automation, and the cars themselves are different. For example, if you were a mechanic or an engineer who knew how to work on V8 engines with manual transmissions and carburetors, your skills are no longer up to date. It means we got to recruit differently, hire differently, and train differently, and that also determines how much leverage people working for a company have over the company. And we get into the product market. Is the product or service that you're making, is it a growth industry, or is it something that's going the way of the dinosaur? For example, I would not want to be somebody who was making cash registers at this point in time, manual cash registers, because where are we heading in retail? Online and self-checkout for the things we're buying. It's crazy. If you can go to a grocery store in this region, I don't hold it against anybody who does self-checkout, but sometimes the lines at the self-checkout are longer than the lines at the actual checkout. So that is changing, and we're not going to be making products for a market that no longer exists. Let me give you a great example. Youngstown, Ohio. What did Youngstown, Ohio recently go through in terms of losing a big employer? Yep, General Motors, the plant that made the Cruze. The Cruze was Chevy's small car. Consumer tastes are changing in the United States. In fact, Ford Motor Company is no longer even making cars other than the Mustang. It's all SUVs and pickups because we have cheap gas and everybody wants large vehicles. So there was an example where the employees in that plant, even though they were members of a union, didn't have a lot of leverage because the company had to change to meet demand of consumers. So in terms of leverage, guys, let's talk about this for a second, just as a generality. If you're an employer, what leverage do you have over employees? Yes, ma'am.
The benefits you may offer them.
Absolutely. If you've got somebody who has a chronic health condition, for example, they want that health insurance. So benefits. What else? What other leverage do we have? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Are you paying a competitive wage? We're paying better than anybody. Try to get better than us. Absolutely. What else? What other leverage do employers have? You might be the only game in town. I'll give you an example. If you work in healthcare in central Pennsylvania, if you work in the Altoona region, there's one hospital system. So that is your one-stop shop. And that, by the way, is the case for most places in rural America at this point. There tends to be one or two healthcare systems. If you work in education in this region, it's actually a little better. We've got 4 major universities, or smaller and varying size universities within driving distance. So there is some competition. That means if there are openings, employers may have to compete to get employees. So at that point, though, if you've got lots of people who want to work and not a lot of jobs, you've got leverage. What leverage do employees have over employers? Yes?
They're the labor.
Yeah, we're the people who get it done. Think about this, guys. Who here has ever had a bad experience at a fast food restaurant? Will somebody share with me their bad experience? Yeah, what's your bad experience?
One time I went to McDonald's and I got 2 cheeseburgers and they didn't have the actual meat in them, just the bun and cheese.
Wow. Yeah, that's a bad experience. Who else has had a bad experience that they're willing to share? Oh, come on, it's always fun to talk bad experiences. Yes.
They just built this Taco Bell in my hometown, and they don't have anyone at the register taking orders. You have to walk in and put it on a touch screen. But since it's new, I guess they just don't know how anything works. And they're not yet confident at running a Taco Bell. So it's just an absolute shit show every time you watch it. It's like a dinner theater almost, because you'll just see people yelling at each other and people dropping stuff, and it's like, I just want a taco, man.
The Dairy Queen in Altoona is very similar. It seems like it's a crisis situation if there are more than 2 people. I mean, literally, you walk in, and I don't even know why there's flour in there, but there's flour all over people. Like people just been fighting with sacks of flour in the back room, and somebody looks like they might have been stabbed. It's like, what's going on here? My point is, though, these employees have leverage over employers. In fact, if they're not doing a good job in the retail sector, you're going somewhere else. At McDonald's, you're not just selling hamburgers, you're selling convenience. So those folks have that kind of leverage. Their leverage is also, if they're not treated well, they'll go someplace else. Their leverage is, if you have somebody who is not redundant, if you got one person in your shop who does something nobody else knows how to do and they walk out, you're in a bad spot. It's called bench strength, and a lot of employers don't think about it. So that's leverage that employees have over employers. Now, what about union? What leverage do union shops have over employers that non-union shops do not? What is it? Yes?
You have the power to negotiate, right?
Definitely, because we're negotiating as a group, not as an individual. What other leverage do we have? Yes?
So if you're in a union and you're treated disrespectfully by your manager, you have the right to get representation in front of your manager.
Absolutely right. You can have a rep with you. You're entitled to representation. What else? Yes? That's exactly right. The biggest leverage that union employees have, basically, let's say, for example, Ryan and I work for the same employer, and he gets treated well, and I'm not. That's my problem if we're in a non-union shop. If it's bad enough and we're a union shop, it means we're all walking out the door. Now, there are situations when employers can pull in non-union employees to do the work. The problem with that is somebody coming onto the job for the first time is not going to be as efficient. There have been times when airlines have had strikes and all of a sudden management had to deal with running daily operations. Do you think any of those flights were on time those days? Yeah, that's leverage that unions have over employers. So yeah, there are advantages to being members of a union. And typically speaking, people who are in unions earn higher wages than their non-union compatriots. You pay dues for that, but you make more money. What are some of the other things that influence the way that work rules are carried out? Part of it is the markets in general. Are we making our facilities better and safer, or are we getting by with substandard facilities? This may sound minor, but think about this, guys. What were the nurses talking about? The nurses were talking about working conditions. Now, they were talking about things like staff ratios, but what about safety? For example, working in an unsafe facility, and all of a sudden the employer can't afford to upgrade it. That affects my daily work rules and the places I go and what I do, even something as simple as what kind of machine I'm operating. And that gets into technology as well. A more high-tech company is going to have different work rules than somebody who's doing more manual labor. So it's going to control the pace of the work and what you're expected to do. Who here has ever heard in manufacturing of something called piece rate? If you haven't heard of it, here's what it means. It means you get paid based on how many pieces of production you make. Now, in the United States, generally speaking, and there are exceptions, you'll earn a minimum wage, and you'll get a percentage based on your piece rate. So let's say, for example, we're working in a factory, and our required piece rate is we have to put out 25 products per half hour. And I am getting behind my piece rate. I won't earn my bonuses. I'll only earn my minimum wage. So technology enables higher piece rates because things are not being manufactured completely by hand. Does that make sense? So that can change our work rules as well. So if I work at a company that's completely manual manufacturing versus a company that is actually doing automated manufacturing, a different level of piece rate could be required. It changes our work rules. Well, I mean, we've got lots of international forces at work here too, guys. In terms of, this may sound like something that's a stretch to tie in. The United States, in one way, shape, or form, has been at war since 2001. We are currently in the midst of the longest wars in the history of the United States, and the majority of people in this building do not remember a time when the United States was not at war. I don't say that to bring your hackles up or your political judgments. It is a fact. How does this affect our working rules? How could this affect the working environment? Yes?
Well, since we've been in war for so long, people are probably going to be retiring from war, they're going to be coming back home, they're going to be needing employment. So we're going to see an unusual amount of people leaving a war-like atmosphere and a war-like work way and trying to adapt back into a regular work life.
Excellent point. And there's a couple of factors that go along with it. Anybody else want to add something to that? There's a couple other factors. Yes?
No, in the past it's been like when the United States is at war, we need more like steel and like metal work.
In the face of war being more technological, maybe not so much. Here's the way it changes, though, in terms of the wars that we're fighting. Number one, we do have people who are leaving the workforce to go to war because they're reservists or being called up in some way, shape, or form, or joining. Those folks, we have to maintain jobs for them when they get back. That's the law. On top of that, we have folks who are coming back from these wars who maybe cannot work in noisy environments now because of things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And here's one of the big ones, guys, is the money that normally came from government into private industry is being reallocated to the war effort. So in terms of money that's being invested from the government into private industry, lots of government grants and things are going other places now. Some of the other international things that affect us. NAFTA has been a big subject of discussion for the current presidential administration. Does anybody know what is NAFTA? Yes?
So the North American Free Trade.
Exactly. And it was essentially intended to give us friction-free commerce between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And by the way, guys, those are two of our 3 top trading partners in the world. Who's the other one? You got it. Who's the number 1 consumer of U.S. exports at this point in time? Mexico. Mexico takes more product from the United States than any other country. Now, how this affected us, well, actually, let me ask you guys this. When we were saying friction-free commerce, were companies in the United States in favor of NAFTA? Companies definitely were. Who wasn't in favor of NAFTA? Employees and labor unions. Why is that? Yes?
Because it more freely allowed things like car manufacturers to set up factories in places
and potentially even less safe factories, even because they have different safety standards. Guys, check this out. When you think of American automobiles, is there anything bigger and bolder and more American than a Chevy Suburban? You know, it's the size of a city block. It's as American as it gets, and it's made in Mexico. The Chevy Suburban is not made in the United States. So we have a lot of cars that are not made in the United States. And we have a lot. GMC, does anybody know what those acronyms stand for? General Motors Canada. So GMC was actually the Canadian division of GM. Now, it existed far before NAFTA. But the bottom line is that this helped international commerce. Now, it can be argued the other direction, too, that a lot of companies within the United States are exporting product to these two neighbors as well. But generally speaking, labor unions were not in favor of it. Now, generally speaking, and when I say this, guys, I never am putting judgment on your political beliefs. I'm just stating affiliations here. Republicans, do they tend to be for or against free trade? They tend to like free trade. Democrats tend to be more for what? Tariffs and protectionist measures. We're in a situation in our country right now where the current president is a Republican and identifies as a conservative, but is actually making decisions that unions are in favor of because he wants more restrictive trade between these countries. I leave that up to your own consciences to decide if that's good or bad, what side we should fall out on. But it's an unusual circumstance. It's something we really haven't seen much of before. And the fact that we have somebody who is a conservative Republican who's taking more of a liberal Democrat stance on trade. It's interesting. And I say that, make up your own minds on it. We can talk about it as much as you want, though. Guys, in terms of other things, we have a global economy these days. In 2011, when the Fukushima disaster happened in Japan because of a tsunami, it affected manufacturing in the United States of Ford pickup trucks because the one element that they needed to make black paint for those trucks only came from that part of Japan. And we're also competing with more imports. More imports means American companies have to be leaner and more competitive, and oftentimes unions are not associated with that kind of competition. And finally, you've got public opinion. Guys, think about this. We talked about the way that the nurses were regarded in that video. Generally speaking, when the nurses were saying why they wanted a union, was that likely to elicit a positive or negative response from the general public? Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's like if you have a nurse basically saying, look, we want to take better care of our patients. On a very superficial level, everybody's going to say, yeah, we agree with that. We want patients to be well taken care of. So public opinion can also play negatively as well. We're going to have a guest speaker from the United Mine Workers here in a couple of weeks. Now, the United Mine Workers did some good things for their employees. They also got a bad reputation, too. One time at Bethlehem 33, which is a mine in Evansburg, Pennsylvania, the union went on strike because the guys did not like the soap that was in the soap machines in the shower. That got a negative opinion of unions. Sometimes the balance of power can swing too far. On one hand, we don't want people who are working children in mines at 12 years old. On the other hand, should we be disrupting production because we don't like the soap in the shower? There are extremes to this stuff. And the court of public opinion can have a lot to do with whether or not a union is going to be successful. So, guys, before we get into this next discussion, are there questions or comments so far? Questions or comments about what we've been discussing? Or about anything? I would like a question or a comment about anything. Let me have a sip of my delicious coffee. Now, that's a very interesting and relevant question. By the letter of the law, this is what we refer to as protected speech. Some people may argue it, and I'm going to give you a very long answer to a short question. We like to say in the United States, well, I can say what I want because I'm protected by the First Amendment, free speech. Free speech is not a carte blanche, free ticket to say anything you want. It is meant to address matters of public concern. So if she were speaking her mind, basically saying wage structures, which she was not talking about, patient care, that is a matter of public concern. She was probably protected by free speech. Could her employer find another reason to fire her? If they looked hard enough? Probably. And this is what happens. When you take the free speech route, I feel terrible saying this because we're supposed to have ideals in here, but there is always a risk associated with it. The idea of free speech was originally created so that public employees, people who work for the government in the United States, could say what they wanted regarding politics and vote for whoever they wanted without fear of getting fired. Now, if she had started making derogatory statements about an employer that came across as in bad faith, for example, somebody saying these guys are a bunch of bums, they're terrible to work for, they're a-holes, whatever, she could get fired for that. The fact that she was saying things in a reasonable manner that were true, I think she's probably pretty well protected. I hope that management there does not take it out on her at some point. So, fair answer?
Yeah, but could it also later hurt if they want a promotion or a raise or anything like that? Can they hold that against them?
Yeah, when we talk about ideals and we talk about reality. For example, if somebody is saying something that technically is protected speech, let's say, for example, their efforts to unionize fail. They don't end up getting a union. Could a supervisor retaliate against her under the guise of something else? They certainly could. So when people organize, they are taking a risk. In fact, some of the movies that we're going to watch this semester, you're going to see people who attempted to organize and paid a lot of prices. In terms of this region, for example, maybe not within your lifetime, but previous union organizers would get physically beat up. Things would happen. The most legendary was Jimmy Hoffa, who basically we're still trying to figure out what happened. Who's ever heard of Jimmy Hoffa? Teamsters organizer. The popular theory is that he's probably in a landfill in New Jersey somewhere, but nobody's completely sure.
Oh, he was under the Giants stadium.
Or Lake St. Francis, maybe. Could be Lake St. Francis, you know. Actually, yeah, maybe he's under the monastery. I don't know. We'll have to find out. But that's an excellent question. Any other questions before we jump back in? Okay, guys. Well, here's my question for you. We have endured a recession, and we're back in a recovery. We're at 3% unemployment, which is great. Can't last forever, but I hope when you guys are hitting the job market, you're still going into that market. If you were trying to organize a union in 2019, are you in a better place or a worse place than you were in 2008? What do you think? Sir?
Better, because like the unemployment rate is so low to where like there's more people who will be willing to risk things. Like I feel like back then people were just more happy to have jobs.
So you've got some leverage over the employer at this point if you did choose to organize. That's a sound point. Any other thoughts? If you were trying to organize a union, are you in a better or worse place than you were in 2008? Yes.
I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but you could also say the opposite, because if it is an employee's market now, you know that even though the conditions might not be good at that job, that you're able to go somewhere else
and gain employment. So you could say that in 2008 it was like more important, or you're in a better position because you're trying to retain the job that you already have.
It's a valid counterpoint. So we're talking on one hand, employees have more leverage. On the other hand, it's easy to get another job if you want one. In fact, it's so easy. Have you guys heard of the phenomenon now that we actually have a term for it called ghosting? Where people are just not showing up for job interviews because they got a better job, or they're not showing up for their first day of work. They're just not showing up. And the term for it is ghosting. So we got one opinion on both sides here. Anybody else have an opinion? Are we in a better or worse spot if you were trying to organize a union? Yes?
I feel like with social media it makes it easier to attract people and get people that feel the same way as you do to create a union.
I think it's a really interesting point, because when you think about the people who would be working age now, people who grew up really as digital natives, who grew up with the internet, social media, would be very comfortable organizing in that fashion. In fact, one of the things that's actually under discussion right now, probably will end up at the Supreme Court at some level, is whether or not social media posts are considered to be protected speech. So say, for example, I work for your company, and I decided I want to start a union, and I'm putting that on my social media, and I get fired because my employer, they violated my First Amendment, is essentially where I'm going with it. I think it's an interesting point, because on one hand, I do think that employees have more leverage now than they had 11 years ago, most certainly. I think that employees, though, who are happy and well taken care of, are less likely to feel the need to organize. That being said, the good times can't last forever. And I think that where you might see an uptick in union organization is if our unemployment rate starts ticking back up a little bit. If we start getting more warning signs that a recession is looming, the people who have the good times right now are not going to want them to end. So I think we might see an uptick then. I could be wrong. In the course of the time we're together, we're going to keep our finger on the pulse of unions as well to see what is happening there. Guys, in terms of how unions make good PR, what they also want to do is see how are you being represented in the media. One of the popular representations of unions, when I say this, I'm not judging anybody, but unions were referred to as mafias or thugs. They were referred to as people who you didn't want to associate with. And part of that was because of some of the tactics that unions had employed. Part of it was because companies also wanted to paint unions as being bad for employees. If you get into the southern part of the United States, some people would even come up with scriptural ways to say unions should not come into being. They actually had religious opposition to unions. We'll talk more about that. In 2019, controlling your message is where it's at. You've got to have a positive view. I'll go back to the nursing union. I think they had a very good representation of why they were striking in the first place. I think maybe they had a more successful PR campaign than maybe our communications folks did on Wednesday. What was the difference in terms of, you saw both those videos, why are the nurses possibly more successful in terms of influencing public opinion than maybe the communications workers were? Yes?
The communication workers didn't seem as though like they wanted to be there. They didn't seem engaged. They smoked cigarettes and
Yeah, it was pretty half-hearted. It's like, we'd like a couple bucks an hour more, sleeping on your cigarette butt, somebody else is juuling over there. It's somebody's cracking open a PBR. It was not as enthusiastic. Why is it so important to have public support if you're trying to make something happen in a union? Yes, ma'am.
If you get press known by your employees, but by your customers, it can really put the pressure on them.
Absolutely. And the public has to be behind you. Let me use the communication workers as an example. Guys, think about it. On an average day, how many hours a day are you on your smartphone? Most of us are like 5, 6, 7, 8, some even higher. Man, if you want to get people's attention, disrupt their smartphone service. And so if the communication workers that don't have the public behind them, and what they're doing is affecting people's service, they're going to start jumping to other carriers if they don't support the union. You're going to have to be willing to put up with some inconveniences in some circumstances to show support to the union. Just like, for example, if a union went on strike at a hospital, are you going to reschedule your appointment? Yes.
When it comes to unions, there's obviously a company and employees. But do unions also, is there, with that other stakeholder of customers, will we learn about how much it affects the customer?
We're definitely going to talk about that. And I think what it comes down to is if you don't have the customer support and you're choosing to go on strike, if you're choosing to take a stand against management, if the public's not in your corner, you're probably not going to have a successful negotiation. Because if people are saying, we don't care about this union, we're going to take our business somewhere else, they're not weathering the storm with the union. For example, in the 1970s in this region, the reason so much of the community was behind the United Mine Workers is because almost everybody worked for the mines. And so public opinion really does matter. Does that make sense, guys? I think it's fascinating how this stuff works together. Some of the other reasons why we're seeing fewer unions these days, guys, we're not a manufacturing country like we used to be. Our number one part of our economy is a service economy. Now, there are service unions. There's SEIU, which also represents healthcare. Some of the largest unions in the United States represent people who work in service. But we're still seeing more, quote-unquote, white-collar, non-union jobs at this point. Now, unions are responding to this by saying we need to recruit in sectors outside of our normal purview, places where we would not normally recruit people. And the unions also took a big hit during the economic recessions. This will just give you some examples of how union membership is declining. If you went back to 1975, almost a quarter of the workforce was a member of a labor union. That's big, 1 in 4. And the most recent statistics our textbook publishes, we've got about 11% of people who are represented who are actually union members. Now you notice, for example, in this chart, 11% are union members, 12% are represented by unions. You may say, how does that work? what it means is, for example, if you work in what's referred to as a closed shop, you may not pay dues, you may not be a member of the union, but you're still covered by the collective bargaining agreement. So even though you don't choose to pay dues or to be a part of the negotiation, you still have to sign the same contract as everybody else. So technically, you're still represented. Guys, that's a huge drop-off, even from 1980. You know, when over a quarter of the population was represented, down to like 12%. If you're in a union at this point, you're also a business as well. You have to remain solvent. So in terms of some of the other practices, guys, firms themselves will hire consultants to try to keep unions out. For example, and we'll get into how you can actually establish a union. A company has right to limit access to their facilities to people who are soliciting. So say, for example, if here at our company, let's say we have Tonkin Incorporated, we've got a no solicitation policy. And if a union organizer comes to my door and says, I want to hand out information to your employees, I can say to that person, I have a non-solicitation policy, you can't trespass, you can't be here. Well, if I let the Salvation Army come in at Christmas time, or if I let the St. Vincent de Paul Society come in and solicit canned food donations, and I don't let the union in, I'm in trouble because I'm unfairly enforcing that policy. The union could come back to me and say that I have an unfair labor practice and I'm limiting access. Go ahead.
Does Walmart have something like that? Because they're very anti-union as a company,
And
yet they still allow, those charitable organizations to come around. I don't know how Walmart doesn't have a union.
Walmart has very powerful lawyers too, and in terms of keeping things tied up in the courts, if I wanted to wait out somebody in a court of law, Walmart or Amazon are not companies I'd want to go up against. So they can keep things tied up in the courts, number one. They have successfully gotten some exemptions for charitable organizations saying, well, we're a large we're a large publicly known company and we're doing something charitable. This is separate from organizing. And they've got around some of those things that way too, but I guarantee you they'll be challenged on it again. I guarantee it, just in the same way that other companies are. But if you're having a union avoidance policy, one of the other things too you can do, basically, if you don't want a union to set up at your shop, if you're a company, try listening to your employees and treating them well. Those are the main ways that people avoid unionization. But you also can, there's nothing that would stop me. Let's say you guys all work for me and you're thinking about forming a union. There's nothing stopping me from having an assembly to tell you guys why you shouldn't have a union. I can't threaten you. I can't use force. That's breaking the law. That's breaking the law by National Labor Relations Board standards, and we'll talk about that. But there's nothing stopping me from pitching you and saying why you have such a good deal. The union does not have the same leverage or access to those employees. I literally can pay you to come and listen to it. They can't, unless they have really deep pockets. And in terms of employment law as well, some people will try to use the law to show you, example, the difficulties of setting up a union and why you shouldn't bother trying it. And again, the bottom line is companies can keep unions out by virtue of the fact that they control the facilities and what happens within them. Guys, we end with some key terms. I'm not going to go through these with you, other than a couple of things I want you to remember from this chapter before we call it a day. The difference between a mediator and an arbitrator. Can anybody tell me the difference between those two? We have a disagreement between two parties. We've got a mediator and an arbitrator. Yes? Yep, the arbitrator can say that basically at the end of this, you have to stick with my decision. The mediator comes to a voluntary settlement. Guys, in terms of work rules, that just means the rules for how we work every day can be everything from hours to conditions of employment. We talked a lot about why unions form and what some of the technology and financial services behind those are. And guys, I think we did a pretty good job of covering the basics. What the rest of this class is going to be about is all the big picture stuff we talked about. If you remember the diagram that we had at the beginning of the chapter, we're going to be diving into specific sections. I anticipate our first test will be after our third chapter. So we covered the first chapter really quickly. The other ones will be more in-depth. Before I let you go for the day, because I'm going to let you go a couple minutes early. Actually, it's 10:48. I'm going to let you go right now. How about that? Go have a nice weekend, guys. Read Chapter 2. We're going to start Chapter 2 on Monday. If you're new to the class today, give me a minute of your time. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, guys.